This episode of the NTPod is dedicated to the memory of Michael Golder. He was a brilliant scholar and he was greatly loved. He'll be remembered with a lot of affection, and his scholarly legacy will be felt, I think, for generations to come. Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NTPod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 26, and today we're going to be looking at the case against Q. In the previous episode of the NTPod, I tried to set out, as best I could, the arguments for the existence of Q. Q, let's remind ourselves, is the hypothetical document that lies behind a lot of the material in Matthew and Luke. You see, most people think, me included, that Matthew and Luke used Mark's Gospel, that Mark's Gospel was important to them, it was the backbone of their own attempts to construct a Gospel. But Matthew's and Luke's use of Mark alone won't solve the synoptic problem, because there is this whole bunch of material in Matthew and Luke that isn't in Mark's Gospel. And for that material, some of it very, very close, some of it nearly 100% verbatim agreement, for that material you have to say, well, where does that come from? And if Matthew and Luke are using Mark independently of one another, then you have to say, well, that material therefore must have come from something like Q, a hypothetical document that both Matthew and Luke had alongside Mark. So the two-source theory is the idea that Matthew and Luke used Mark and Q as the kind of the basis of their Gospels. Now, I wrote a book called The Case Against Q a few years ago, and I've also written introductory materials on this. I have websites on it and so on. And so to try and summarise my own case against Q in one episode of the NT-Pod might seem to be something of a challenge, but I'm going to have a go. And what I'll do is there are some elements in the case that I would like to spell out in a little more detail, but I'll save those for the future. For the time being, I'll try and get my case against Q into a nutshell. For the case against Q really to be understood, one of the things that you have to do, first of all, is take those arguments for Q and look to see how persuasive they are. Because so many of those arguments for Q, as we saw last time, are basically arguments against Luke's use of Matthew. So you have to say, well, how persuasive are they at telling us that Luke didn't know Matthew? I don't think they are persuasive, and I'll try and explain why. The first of the arguments that gets used against Luke's use of Matthew is the whole business of Luke's order, the idea that Luke would not have destroyed Matthew's wonderful discourses, especially things like the Sermon on the Mount. The problem with this argument is that it's essentially a kind of aesthetic judgment. It's a value judgment. It's essentially saying, if I were Luke, I wouldn't have done this. And it's a very difficult argument, therefore, to assess because it's so subjective. One way that I've tried to assess it is to say, well, do other people share that aesthetic judgment? Do other people say that Matthew's Sermon on the Mount is so wonderful in all its glory that we wouldn't break it up? Well, they certainly don't. I mean, lots of artists do break up Matthew's sermon. Pier Paolo Pasolini, in one of the most famous of the Jesus films, The Gospel According to St. Matthew, does exactly what Luke does, moves the Sermon on the Mount later in his narrative, he changes key bits of it, he shortens it greatly, and so on. So I think it's a kind of value judgment that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. What Luke has done in the Sermon on the Mount, I think, is completely understandable. And in fact, what Luke seems to be trying to do in his Gospel is to present a kind of plausible biographical kind of narrative in which sayings are interspersed with actual kind of narrative incidents. And so Luke takes lots of bits of things like the Sermon on the Mount and puts them in appropriate context elsewhere. So, for example, he has lots of the teaching on prayer from Matthew's sermon in his section about prayer in Luke chapter 11. But it's not just a question of Luke rearranging the material that you find in Matthew. It's also that Q scholars say that Luke wouldn't have omitted so much material from Matthew had he known Matthew. And the kind of example that people give are things like the story of the Magi. Well, what I say to this is it's not at all surprising that Luke doesn't include a lot of the material in Matthew. I mean, for one thing, there's a kind of circularity to this argument anyway. Of course, Luke doesn't have the special Matthean material, because if he did have that material, we'd call it Q material. So he doesn't have it by definition. But I suppose the argument is that Luke wouldn't have omitted some of this material. And I just feel that in every case where you look at the detail of the material that Luke must have omitted from Matthew, it's entirely explicable on the basis of what we know about Luke's habits elsewhere. Well, let's take that example of the Magi. Would Luke, in his birth narrative, have included the Magi, had he known that story, the adoration of the Magi coming to visit the baby Jesus? Well, I don't think he would for a minute, because Luke, we know from his second volume, Acts of the Apostles, Luke we know doesn't like Magi. One of the chief villains in the whole book is a magician. He's called Simon Magus, and Luke isn't going to include people like that right at the beginning of his gospel, and he inserts instead the entirely more appropriate characters of these shepherds. But for Q scholars, it isn't just a question of Luke omitting whole pericopes, whole passages from Matthew's Gospel. It's also, they say, that Luke doesn't include Matthew's versions of Markan material. In other words, where Matthew adds a few little details, a few little redactional details added to Mark, why doesn't Luke include those? And my answer there is, he does. Lots of the time. In fact, there's an entire category called by two source theorists Mark Q overlaps, and the Mark Q overlap passages are essentially those passages, I think, where Luke has based his account primarily on Matthew's versions of Mark. You see them particularly richly towards the beginning of his gospel, when he's trying his best to try and reconcile Matthew and Mark. So in the whole of Luke 3 and 4 you see versions of the Markan material which are actually much closer to Matthew, and Q scholars are fully aware of that, and that's why they have to say, well, here Mark and Q overlapped. In fact, I argue that there's a kind of continuum of Matthean influence on Luke, from those kind of passages where he's primarily dependent on Mark, to those where he has Mark but with a few little agreements with Matthew, to those passages where he has almost entire agreement with Matthew and very little of Mark. And that's basically what Luke looks like. The difficulty is that so often we see the data through the eyes of the theory that is trying to describe it, and that's why we need to approach the data first, look at the data, and then say, how does our different solution to the synoptic problem deal with it? There's a fourth argument for Q that also needs to be addressed, and this is the argument from alternating primitivity, the idea that sometimes Matthew, sometimes Luke has the more original form of a saying that is in the double tradition. Well, for me here, quite often when you look more closely at the examples that are given, you find that they just evaporate. You find that the case for the primitivity or the greater antiquity of Luke isn't fully founded. So to take the real textbook example, Matthew 5:3 has, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," whereas Luke has, "Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." And there it's very easy to understand why Luke would have adjusted Matthew so that you have "Blessed are the poor," because Luke all the way through his gospel has this kind of blessing on the poor. He adds a woe to the rich. It's an eschatological reversal, a reversal at the end times that will cause the poor to be rewarded and the rich to be brought down. It's right there in the Magnificat Mary's song at the beginning of Luke's gospel. It's there again at the synagogue in Nazareth, where Jesus announces that he's been anointed to preach good news to the poor. You find it over and over again in Luke's gospel. So the idea that he would have adjusted Matthew's beatitude on the poor in spirit and make it the poor is entirely understandable. I mean, I think there may be cases where Luke is a little more primitive. I wouldn't rule that at all out, because after all, Luke doesn't just have copies of literary works. He's living in the sort of living stream, if you like, of oral tradition, and therefore sometimes he adjusts his literary sources in the light of the oral tradition that he knows all too well. And I think that may well be what's going on in the Lord's Prayer, for example. I think when he gets to his literary version of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, Luke thinks, I know a version of the Lord's Prayer which is a little different from that. I'm going to give you the version that I know. And I don't think that there's anything surprising or unusual about that. And in fact, it's what ancient writers would do all the time. If they knew something from their oral tradition which was a little different from their literary source, then they would use that as an alternative. In general, then, I think the arguments against Luke's use of Matthew are quite weak. And let me just illustrate the way that I see things from a contemporary analogy. Several years ago, I remember in a university setting having two pieces of work from students that were very, very similar. So similar that someone somewhere had been doing some copying. And we got each of the two students into separate rooms and asked them what had gone on. I must admit, the irony of it was that actually I thought that each of the students might have been using the same book and copying out of it. In other words, I was arguing for a kind of Q-type solution. But as it turned out, when we interviewed the two students, one of them confessed to having copied off the other one, and the other one expressed horror that this essay that she'd lent to her friend had then got copied by her friend. So we were able straightforwardly to say, well, clearly one person's copied off the other. Now, the point of that analogy is that if you do see two pieces of work which have really, really similar material in, your first instinct really needs to be to say one of them may have copied from the other, and let's see if we can find any good reasons for that not to be the case. Especially if what you're doing in saying that that didn't happen is appealing to another entire document for which we have no other evidence. There's a thing called Occam's razor. It's an old philosophical principle which basically means that you don't multiply entities beyond what's necessary. And in my opinion, Q simply isn't necessary to explain the data. The data are better explained with Luke's direct use of Matthew alongside his use of Mark. Indeed, there have always been problems with the Q theory, which two-source theorists are very aware of. For example, when Luke copies out of Mark, we regularly see him bringing up little agreements with Matthew, little, I would say, reminiscences of the Matthean text, little things that he inserts into his story. There's one famous one in Mark 14:65, and where Matthew and Luke both agree together against Mark there. What happens is it's when Jesus is being interrogated, and there's this horrible mockery, where in Mark they simply hit him and say, prophesy. But in Matthew and Luke they agree together and say, and they add, who is it who smote you? The same identical 5 words in Greek. And what the Farrer theorist says, someone like me, is, well, Luke has simply copied those words out of Matthew. What the two-source theorist has to say is, well, where could these words have come from? They can't have come from Q, because Q doesn't have a passion narrative according to the two-source theory. So they say, well, perhaps the manuscripts have got corrupted. And when you get to that stage where the Achilles heel in the theory is such that you have to appeal to corruption in the manuscripts to explain the evidence, then I think you have to put a question mark against the theory and say, well, is there an alternative theory that explains the data better? So for me, the Farrer theory, the idea that Luke used Matthew and Mark, is preferable to the Q theory, but you have to be aware that I'm in the minority on this one, and if you want to investigate these kind of issues further, there's lots of materials available on the net, and I'll put 1 or 2 things available in the programme notes to this episode over on my NT blog. But thanks very much for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It's been a pleasure having your company as always. There are 3 extended episodes available on the synoptic problem, which you can also find on the feeds, and you can find everything connected to the NT Pod on podacre, podacre.blogspot.com, or you can just search for the NT Pod on Duke's iTunes U. Thanks again for listening.